Or you fix this truck that no one has been able to, or you're fired. But 5 minutes later, the smell of oil and grease saturated the air at Mitchell & Sons Auto Shop, located on the outskirts of New York. James Michael Carter, known to everyone simply as James, wiped his hands on the already grimy rag he always carried in his pocket. His 42 years of life and 15 years of dedication to that shop were about to be put to the test in the cruelest way he could imagine. "James, I need to speak with you now." Richard Mitchell's voice cut through the noise of the tools like a sharp blade. The shop manager, a man in always impeccable suits with a calculating gaze, gestured toward the red truck that had occupied the main bay for 3 months, like an unsolvable puzzle. James felt a tightening in his chest. He knew that tone of voice. It was the same one Richard used before firing someone. Around the shop, the other mechanics quieted their activities, pretending not to pay attention to the conversation about to happen. But James knew everyone was listening to every word. "This truck arrived here 3 months ago," began Richard, pointing to the vehicle with a theatrical gesture. "3 of our best mechanics have tried to fix it. Daniel, who has 20 years of experience, gave up. William, whom you trained yourself, said it's impossible. Even old George, who knows engines like no one else, threw in the towel." James swallowed hard. George was a legend in the shop, a 68-year-old man who seemed to understand engines just by the sound they made. If even he had given up, the situation was more serious than he imagined. "And now," Richard continued, crossing his arms and adopting an even more intimidating posture, "are you going to tell me you can't do it either? Because if that's the case, maybe it's time to rethink your position here in the company." The words hit James like a punch in the stomach. 15 years of honest work, early mornings fixing vehicles, dedication that had even cost him problems in his marriage, all of it was being put at risk by a challenge that seemed impossible. "Mr. Richard," James tried to keep his voice steady, "I can take a look at the truck, but if 3 experienced mechanics couldn't—" "I don't care what the others couldn't do," Richard interrupted him brutally. "I care about what you will do. Either you fix this truck that no one has managed to in 3 months, or you're fired. You have until the end of the workday." The silence that followed was deafening. James could hear his own heart beating irregularly as he processed the ultimatum. 5 o'clock. It was only 2 in the afternoon, giving him 3 hours to solve a problem that had defeated 3 experienced mechanics in 90 days. "Understood, sir," murmured James, walking toward the truck with heavy steps. His colleagues watched him with a mix of pity and relief that they weren't in his place. The truck was a relatively new model, an international Durastar that shouldn't have such complex problems. James opened the hood and leaned over the engine, trying to identify what could be the issue that had baffled 3 experienced professionals. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. James began his inspection methodically, as he always did. First, he checked the oil and water levels, then tested the battery and examined the belts. Everything seemed normal. The engine was clean. The parts appeared to be in perfect condition. Why the hell wouldn't that truck work? 5 minutes after accepting the challenge, something caught his attention. It was a detail that apparently no one had noticed. A small inconsistency in the position of a cable behind the instrument panel. James bent down to examine it more closely and discovered that a cable had been disconnected. Could it really be that simple? He thought to himself. The problem wasn't with the engine itself, but with a loose cable behind the dashboard. It was the cable responsible for communication between the electronic control unit and the injection system. Without this connection, the truck simply wouldn't work. But as he tried to reconnect the cable, James made a disturbing discovery. The cable hadn't come loose naturally, it had been cut. And it wasn't an accidental cut caused by wear or vibration. The marks on the cable clearly indicated that someone had used pliers to deliberately cut it. James felt a chill down his spine. Why would someone intentionally sabotage a truck? And why this specific truck? He looked around to make sure no one was watching and examined the cable more carefully. The tool marks were unmistakable. The cable had been cut with precision, and from the oxidation on the cut, it had happened at least 2 months ago. This meant the truck had arrived at the shop already sabotaged, and all this time 3 experienced mechanics had been trying to find a problem with the engine that simply didn't exist. "James, how's it going?" Richard's voice behind him made him jump. The manager had approached silently, and his presence there made James realize something strange. Richard seemed nervous, restless, very different from the confident posture he had shown minutes before. "I found the problem, Mr. Richard," James replied cautiously. "It was a disconnected cable, simple as that." "A disconnected cable?" Richard repeated, and James noticed his voice sounded strange, as if he was surprised by the discovery. "What kind of cable?" "The electronic injection system cable." "But there's something strange," James began, but was interrupted. "Strange how?" Richard asked quickly, and James could detect growing tension in his voice. "The cable didn't come loose naturally, it was cut," James said, watching his boss's reaction closely. Richard visibly paled. His hands, which moments earlier had been gesturing confidently, now trembled slightly. He avoided looking directly at the engine and quickly changed the subject. "Cut? Must have been some accident during transport or handling. The important thing is you managed to identify the problem. Can you fix it?" "Yes, I can. I just need to reconnect the cable and run a test," James replied, but something about Richard's reaction deeply bothered him. An experienced manager wouldn't react that way to a simple technical discovery. While soldering the cable and performing the necessary tests, James couldn't stop thinking about Richard's strange reaction. Why had he gotten so nervous about the discovery? And why did he seem to avoid talking about the vehicle's history? When he reconnected the cable and started the truck, the engine fired up immediately. The smooth, regular rumble of the International Durastar engine indicated it was working perfectly. 3 months of puzzle solving resolved in 15 minutes of careful investigation, but James didn't feel triumphant. The discovery of the intentionally cut cable left him deeply disturbed. Who would do this, and why? And why had Richard reacted so suspiciously? "All done, Mr. Richard," James announced when the manager returned to the bay. "The truck is working perfectly." Richard approached hesitantly, as if he didn't want to be there. "Are you sure everything's okay? It won't give us problems again?" "I'm sure. It was just the injection system cable that was disconnected. Now it's working like it should have since the first day it arrived here," James replied, deliberately emphasizing the last words to observe Richard's reaction. The manager avoided James's gaze and quickly changed the subject. "Well, then consider the problem resolved. You can go back to your normal work." But James was not willing to let the matter go. "Mr. Richard, about the cable being cut, don't you think it's strange? Maybe we should investigate how it happened." "There's no need to investigate anything," Richard replied with a sharpness that surprised James. "These things happen. What's important is that it's fixed now." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Jennifer, one of the administrative staff. She approached the bay where the truck was and greeted the 2 men. "Hi, James." "Hi, Richard. Did you finally fix the problem with your brother-in-law's truck?" she asked casually, unaware of the tension her question would cause. James felt as if he had received an electric shock. Brother-in-law? The truck belonged to the manager's brother-in-law? That would explain a lot about Richard's strange behavior. "Jennifer, can you go back to your department?" Richard said quickly, with a harsh tone that startled the woman. "Sorry, Richard, I didn't mean to bother. I just wanted to know if you finally got it fixed," she replied, stepping away confused by the manager's unexpected reaction. James and Richard were alone again, but the atmosphere had completely changed. The information revealed by Jennifer had put a new perspective on the whole situation. "The truck belongs to your brother-in-law?" James asked directly. "Yes, it's David's, my brother-in-law, so what? That doesn't change anything about the work that needed to be done." Richard tried to sound casual, but his voice betrayed nervousness. "It does change, Mr. Richard. It changes because now I understand why you were so nervous about the discovery of the cut cable. And it changes because it makes me wonder why a cable would be purposely cut on a family truck," James said, maintaining a respectful but firm tone. Richard was silent for a few seconds, clearly trying to think of an adequate response. James could see the gears turning in the manager's mind, searching for a way to get around the situation. "James, you're imagining things. The cable must have been damaged during transport or improper handling. These things happen, Richard finally replied, but his explanation sounded unconvincing. With all due respect, Mr. Richard, but I've been working with cars for 15 years. I know the difference between a cable that wore out naturally and one that was cut with a tool. And this one was definitely cut on purpose, James insisted. The tension in the air was palpable. Other employees in the shop began to notice something was going on and discreetly moved closer to hear the conversation better. James, my patience has its limits. The truck is working, the job is done. That's all that matters. Now return to your station and stop asking unnecessary questions, Richard said authoritatively, trying to end the conversation. But James was not willing to be intimidated. 15 years of honest work gave him the right to question suspicious situations. Mr. Richard, if someone intentionally sabotaged this truck, that's a serious problem. We can't just ignore it. No one sabotaged anything, Richard exploded, losing his composure. You're seeing problems where there are none. Do your job and stop making up absurd theories. Richard's outburst of anger only confirmed James's suspicions that there was something very wrong with the whole situation. An innocent manager wouldn't react so aggressively to a legitimate concern from an employee. At that moment, James made a decision that would change his life forever. He wasn't going to simply accept Richard's inadequate explanation and pretend nothing had happened. There was something very suspicious about this whole story, and he was determined to uncover the truth. "All right, Mr. Richard. I'll get back to my work," James said calmly, but his mind was already working on how to investigate more deeply what was happening. Richard seemed relieved by James's apparent submission and quickly walked away from the bay as if wanting to escape the situation. But James had memorized every detail of the conversation and every reaction from the manager. During the rest of the afternoon, while working on other vehicles, James couldn't stop thinking about the cut cable and Richard's strange reaction. Why would someone sabotage a truck? And what could be the connection between this sabotage and the fact that the vehicle belonged to the manager's brother-in-law? At 4 in the afternoon, when James was lost in thought while changing the oil of a Honda Civic, Jennifer appeared discreetly at his side. "James, can I talk to you for a minute?" she asked in a low voice, looking around to make sure Richard wasn't nearby. "Of course, Jennifer. What is it?" "It's about the truck belonging to Richard's brother-in-law. I didn't want to cause trouble, but there are some strange things I've been noticing for a while," she said hesitantly. James felt his heart race. "What kind of strange things?" "Well, this isn't the first truck of David's that comes here for repairs. In the last 2 years, he's brought in at least 5 different vehicles, and all of them had very specific problems that took a long time to fix," Jennifer explained. "What kind of problems?" "Always electrical or electronic problems, never obvious mechanical issues, and it always takes months to resolve. And there's something else. Richard always rejects the first estimates the mechanics make for these vehicles of his brother-in-law," Jennifer continued. James felt a chill down his spine. A pattern was beginning to form in his mind. "Do you remember how many estimates were rejected for this truck?" 3. Daniel made an estimate suggesting replacement of the injection module. It was rejected. William suggested a complete review of the electrical system. Also rejected. George suggested a detailed check of the electronic control unit. Rejected too, Jennifer listed, and all of them mentioned electrical problems? Exactly. All suspected problems in the electrical system, but Richard always said it was too expensive and told them to look for other solutions, Jennifer confirmed. James was beginning to understand what was happening. 3 experienced mechanics had correctly identified that the problem was electrical, but Richard had rejected all suggestions, forcing them to look for non-existent problems in the engine. "Jennifer, do you have access to this truck's documents? Paperwork, history, those things?" James asked. "Yes, I do. Why?" "I need to see the documentation. There's something very strange going on here, and I need to understand the situation better," James explained. Jennifer hesitated for a moment, clearly worried about the possible consequences. "James, if Richard finds out I'm showing documents to you, he won't find out. And if he does, I'll take full responsibility. Jennifer, this is important. There might be something very serious happening here. James said sincerely. Convinced by James's seriousness, Jennifer agreed. "All right, but it has to be discreet. I'll get the documents and meet you in the storeroom in 10 minutes. While waiting for Jennifer in the small storeroom of the auto shop, James tried to organize the information he had gathered so far. A deliberately cut cable, a pattern of electrical problems in vehicles from the same owner, systematically rejected estimates, and an extremely nervous manager. All these elements pointed to something very suspicious. Jennifer arrived at the storeroom carrying a folder with documents. "Here are all the papers related to the truck," she said, handing the folder to James. James opened the folder and began examining the documents. There was the vehicle's entry slip at the shop, the work orders from the 3 mechanics who tried to fix it, and what interested him the most, the truck's original documentation. While examining the vehicle transfer document, James made a shocking discovery. The truck had been transferred from the company to David, Richard's brother-in-law, just 1 week before being brought to the shop with problems. "Jennifer, this document here, was the truck company owned?" James asked, pointing to the transfer document. "Yes, the company has a fleet of trucks for equipment transport. That one was sold to David for a very low price, if I'm not mistaken," Jennifer confirmed. James continued examining the documents and found something even more disturbing. There was a technical inspection of the truck done by the shop itself just 2 weeks before the sale to David. And in that inspection, the truck was described as being in perfect working condition with no apparent issues. "Jennifer, look at this. 2 weeks before being sold to David, the truck underwent an inspection here at our shop and was approved with no problems." James showed the document to Jennifer. "That is really strange. How does a truck in perfect condition develop a complex electrical issue in 2 weeks?" Jennifer reflected. "It doesn't," James said with growing conviction, "unless someone created that problem on purpose." The two fell silent for a few moments, absorbing the implications of the discovery. If James was right, someone had deliberately sabotaged the truck after the sale to David. "But why would anyone do that?" Jennifer asked. "That's the million-dollar question," James replied. "But I have some ideas. Jennifer, can you help me with one more thing?" "What do you need?" "I need to see the documentation for the other vehicles David brought here for repairs over the last 2 years. I want to check if there's a pattern," James explained. Jennifer agreed to help, but warned they needed to be very careful not to draw attention. They arranged to meet again at the end of the workday to examine the additional documents. Meanwhile, James went back to his normal work, but his mind was completely focused on the mystery of the sabotaged truck. He was beginning to suspect he had discovered something much bigger than a simple cut wire. At 5 o'clock, quitting time, James stayed at the shop under the pretext of finishing a job. Most employees had already left, including Richard, who left quickly without saying goodbye to anyone. Jennifer reappeared with more documents. "I managed to pull the history of the last 5 vehicles David brought here, and the pattern is even stranger than we imagined." James examined the documents with growing alarm. All 5 vehicles had followed the same pattern. They were from the company fleet, were sold to David for prices significantly below market value, and all developed complex electrical or electronic problems just days after the sale. "Jennifer, this is no coincidence. Someone is systematically sabotaging these vehicles," James concluded. "But why? What would be the goal?" Jennifer asked, clearly disturbed by the findings. James was beginning to form a theory, but needed more information before reaching any definitive conclusion. "Jennifer, do you know David personally? Do you know what kind of business he's in?" "I know him by sight. He has a large rural property out in Westchester. They say he's very well off, but I never knew exactly what he does for a living," Jennifer replied. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like the video and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us out as we're just getting started. Now continuing. "A rural property," James murmured thoughtfully. "Jennifer, in the vehicle documents, did you see where they were transported after the repair?" Jennifer picked up the documents and checked. Strange. In all cases, the vehicles were picked up by David himself and taken directly to his property in Westchester. James was starting to see the full picture, company vehicles being sold at low prices, then sabotaged, repaired at the auto shop, and finally taken to David's property. But one puzzle piece was still missing. Jennifer, one last question. Do you have any information about equipment being transported in these vehicles? Jennifer thought for a moment before answering. Now that you mention it, I remember Daniel mentioned once that he found remnants of electronic equipment in one of David's trucks. Expensive equipment, testing and measurement devices. The last puzzle piece clicked into place in James's mind. Expensive company equipment being transported in vehicles that were later sold at low prices to the manager's brother-in-law. And when these vehicles developed problems, they stayed for months at the auto shop, enough time for the equipment to be discreetly removed and transported. Jennifer, I think we've uncovered a scheme of misappropriation of company equipment, James said quietly. You mean they're stealing company equipment using the trucks? Jennifer asked, shocked. Not stealing. It's more sophisticated than that. They sell the trucks to David at low prices but with expensive equipment still inside. Then they sabotage the trucks so they stay for months at the auto shop, giving them time to discreetly remove the equipment without raising suspicions, James explained his theory. Jennifer turned pale as she understood the implications. James, this is very serious. If true, Richard is involved in fraud against the company itself. And now that I've discovered the cut cable, they know I'm close to the truth. That's why Richard was so nervous, James added. The two remained silent for a few minutes, processing the gravity of the situation. James knew he had discovered something that could destroy careers and perhaps even result in legal action. But he also knew he couldn't simply pretend nothing had happened. Jennifer, I need your help with something very important, James finally said. What do you want me to do? I need you to help me document all of this properly. We'll need solid evidence if we want to expose this scheme without them finding a way to frame us, James explained. Jennifer hesitated. James, this is very dangerous. If they find out we know, if we do nothing, they'll keep stealing from the company, and who knows how many innocent employees could be harmed in the future. Besides, now that I know the truth, I can't just pretend nothing happened, James argued. Convinced by James's sincerity and determination, Jennifer agreed to help. They devised a plan to collect more evidence discreetly over the next few days. The next morning, James arrived early at the auto shop as he always did. But this time he had a specific goal: to examine David's truck more thoroughly before anyone showed up. Upon opening the truck's hood, James made an additional discovery that confirmed his suspicions. There were marks in the engine compartment indicating that heavy equipment had been transported there recently. Small scratches and tie-down marks that wouldn't be present on a truck used only for normal transport. James discreetly photographed the marks with his cell phone, creating a visual record of the evidence. He knew he would need much more than his word against the managers if he wanted to expose the scheme. Around 8 in the morning, Richard arrived at the auto shop. James immediately noticed that the manager seemed even more tense than the day before. His eyes were red, as if he hadn't slept well, and he avoided looking in the direction of the repaired truck. James, good work yesterday with the truck. David can come pick up the vehicle this afternoon, Richard said, trying to sound casual. Already, Mr. Richard? Wouldn't it be wise to do some additional tests to make sure it won't have problems again? James suggested. It's not necessary. The problem is fixed, as you said yourself yesterday, Richard replied quickly, clearly anxious for the truck to leave the auto shop as soon as possible. Richard's insistence on removing the truck quickly only reinforced James's suspicions. If it were a normal repair, the manager would allow additional tests to ensure the quality of the work. During the morning, James continued observing Richard's behavior. The manager made several phone calls in a low voice, always moving away from the employees so he wouldn't be heard. In one of these calls, James managed to catch a few words. Problem solved. This afternoon, and no complications. Around noon, an unexpected situation occurred. A well-dressed man, carrying an executive briefcase, entered the auto shop and asked for Richard. Jennifer, who was at the reception, directed the visitor to the manager's office. James took the opportunity to discreetly approach the office and try to listen to the conversation. The voices were low, but he managed to catch some phrases that left him even more alarmed. Discrepancies in the inventories, equipment not found, and internal audit were some of the words James could make out. The presence of an internal auditor at the auto shop on the same day the truck was to be removed couldn't be a coincidence. James realized the situation was quickly becoming complicated and that he might not have much time to collect all the evidence he needed. When the auditor left Richard's office, the manager was visibly shaken. His hands were trembling, and he seemed to have trouble focusing on the auto shop's normal activities. James took advantage of a moment when Richard was distracted to approach Jennifer at the reception. "Jennifer, who was that man talking to Richard?" "It was Mr. Timothy from the company's internal audit department. He said he's investigating some irregularities in the equipment inventories," Jennifer replied quietly. James's heart raced. An equipment inventory audit in the middle of the scheme he had uncovered. The situation was becoming very dangerous, very quickly. "Jennifer, we need to act fast. If they remove the truck today, we'll lose important evidence," James whispered urgently. "What do you want to do?" "We need to photograph the inside of the truck before they come to get it, and I need to check for traces of equipment that might have been transported illegally," James explained. The two waited for an opportunity when Richard left the auto shop for lunch. Quickly, James thoroughly examined the inside of the truck, photographing every mark, scratch, or evidence that heavy equipment had been transported. In the truck's glove compartment, James made a crucial discovery. There were several equipment transfer documents from the company to David's property. The documents showed specific dates and times of loading and delivery. "Jennifer, look at this," James showed her the documents. "These dates here, they don't match the dates when the truck started having problems." Jennifer examined the documents. "You're right. According to these papers, the truck transported equipment to David's property 2 weeks after it started having problems. How could a faulty truck make deliveries? Because it wasn't faulty when it made those deliveries. The cable was cut afterward to create an excuse to keep the truck at the shop," James concluded. The discovery of the documents in the glove compartment was the definitive evidence that James was right about the scheme. The documents proved that the truck had been used to transport company equipment even after supposedly developing problems. James quickly photographed all the documents, knowing that Richard would return from lunch soon. He and Jennifer put everything back exactly as it was before. At 2 in the afternoon, David arrived at the shop to pick up the truck. James discreetly watched him and noticed that he seemed extremely nervous. His eyes kept shifting and he avoided eye contact with anyone. "Is the truck ready?" David asked Richard quietly. "Yes, it is. James managed to fix the problem yesterday," Richard replied, also in a low voice. "Great. Can I take it now?" "Of course. Jennifer can handle the paperwork for you," Richard said, signaling for Jennifer to prepare the vehicle release documents. James positioned himself strategically to observe David's reaction when he saw the truck working. What he saw confirmed his suspicions. David showed no surprise or joy at seeing the problem resolved. In fact, he seemed almost disappointed. A normal person would be happy to see an expensive problem finally fixed. David reacted like someone who already knew the problem was easily solvable and was counting on it. While Jennifer prepared the paperwork, James approached the truck for a final check and took the opportunity to memorize the license plate and other details that might be useful later. "Mr. David, just to confirm, you haven't had any more problems with the other vehicles we repaired here in recent years?" James asked casually. David became visibly uncomfortable with the question. No. They were all resolved satisfactorily," he replied, avoiding looking directly at James. "That's good. It's rare to see so many similar electrical problems in vehicles belonging to the same person. Usually these issues are isolated," James continued, closely watching David's reaction. "Yeah, must just be bad luck," David murmured, clearly wanting to end the conversation. Richard noticed the growing tension and quickly intervened. "James, you can get back to your work. Mr. David is in a hurry." But James wasn't willing to give up easily. "Of course, Mr. Richard. I just wanted to make sure our client is satisfied with the service. Mr. David, if the truck has any problems again, don't hesitate to come to our shop." The irony in James's voice didn't go unnoticed by Richard or David. Both understood that he knew more than he was saying. David hurried to complete the paperwork and left the shop driving the truck, clearly wanting to get away from the place as quickly as possible. Richard watched him, until he disappeared around the corner. "James, I need to speak with you," Richard said in a serious tone. "Of course, Mr. Richard." "Your attitude toward Mr. David was inappropriate. He's an important client, and I don't like it when my employees ask unnecessary questions," Richard reprimanded. "I'm sorry, sir. I was just trying to ensure good customer service," James replied diplomatically. "In the future, stick to the technical work. Administrative matters are with me," Richard said firmly. James nodded, but internally he was more convinced than ever that he had uncovered something serious. Richard's defensive reaction and David's obvious nervousness confirmed that they knew he was close to the truth. For the rest of the afternoon, James continued working normally, but his mind was focused on how to proceed with the evidence he had collected. He knew he needed to be very careful as he was dealing with people who might try to harm him professionally if they found out he knew the truth. At 5 in the afternoon, when most employees had already left, James remained in the auto shop organizing his tools and reflecting on the situation. It was then that Jennifer approached him with a worried expression. "James, Mr. Timothy is back and wants to speak with you," she said quietly. "With me? Why?" "He said he's investigating irregularities related to the equipment transported by the vehicles repaired here. Apparently someone mentioned that you worked on several of those vehicles," Jennifer explained. James felt a mix of relief and apprehension. On one hand, the internal auditor's presence suggested the company was already investigating the scheme he had uncovered. On the other hand, he could be under investigation as a possible accomplice. "Where is he?" James asked. "In the meeting room. He's waiting for you." James walked to the meeting room with his heart racing. He knew this conversation would be crucial in determining whether he would be seen as a collaborator in the investigation or as a suspect. Timothy was a man of about 50, with a serious but not intimidating appearance. He gestured for James to sit and opened a folder full of documents. "Mr. James, thank you for coming. I'm Timothy Carter from the Internal Audit Department. I'm investigating some irregularities related to the company's equipment transportation and storage," he began. "How can I help you, Mr. Timothy?" "Well, my records show that you worked on the maintenance of several vehicles that were used to transport valuable company equipment. I'd like to know if you noticed anything unusual during those jobs," Timothy explained. James realized this was his opportunity to expose the scheme he had discovered, but he knew he needed to be very careful in how he presented the information. "Mr. Timothy, may I ask what specifically is being investigated?" James asked cautiously. "We have significant discrepancies between equipment purchased by the company and equipment found in our inventories. Some expensive equipment has simply disappeared, and we're trying to track down where this might have happened," Timothy explained. James made a decision that would change his life. "Mr. Timothy, I think I have information that could help your investigation, but I need to be sure I'll be protected from retaliation." Timothy leaned forward, clearly interested. "What kind of information do you have?" "I discovered evidence that some vehicles were deliberately sabotaged to create an excuse to keep them in the auto shop for long periods. During that time, equipment could be discreetly removed without raising suspicions," James revealed. "Sabotaged how?" James explained in detail his discovery of the cut cable in David's truck, the evidence of heavy equipment transport, and the suspicious pattern of electrical problems in all the manager's brother-in-law's vehicles. Timothy listened attentively, taking detailed notes. "Do you have physical evidence of these claims?" "I do," James replied, showing the photos he had discreetly taken with his cell phone. Timothy examined the photos carefully. "Mr. James, this is very important evidence. Do you have any idea who might be behind this scheme?" "I have suspicions, but I'd prefer you draw your own conclusions based on the evidence," James replied diplomatically. "I understand." "Mr. James, I'd like you to continue working normally, but stay alert to any additional suspicious activity, and please maintain absolute confidentiality about our conversation. The investigation is ongoing and we don't want to alert potential individuals involved," Timothy instructed. "Understood, Mr. Timothy. One last question. Do you have any evidence that other employees might be involved?" James hesitated before answering. "I believe most employees are innocent, but there are indications that the responsible person has enough authority to reject technical budgets and influence the mechanics' work." Timothy nodded, clearly understanding the implication. Very well, Mr. James, you'll be contacted soon, and thank you for coming forward with this information. It shows professional integrity. When James left the meeting room, he felt both relieved and apprehensive. On one hand, he had done the right thing by reporting the fraudulent scheme. On the other hand, he knew the coming days would be very tense, especially if Richard suspected he had spoken with the auditor. The next morning, James arrived at the auto shop expecting to find Richard in panic, but the manager seemed strangely calm. Throughout the morning, Richard behaved normally, assigning tasks and supervising work. Around 10 o'clock, Jennifer discreetly approached James. "James, I have bad news. Mr. Timothy came to me earlier today and said the investigation has been suspended." James felt his blood run cold. Suspended? Why? He said new developments in the investigation made it unnecessary to continue investigating the auto shop. He didn't give more details, Jennifer explained. James couldn't believe what he was hearing. How could an investigation with such clear evidence be suspended overnight? Something was very wrong. During lunch, James decided to call Timothy to try to understand what had happened. But when he called the internal audit department, he was told that Timothy was on medical leave with no estimated return date. The coincidence was very suspicious. A healthy auditor, who was in the middle of an important investigation, doesn't go on medical leave overnight without a very serious reason. James began to realize he had underestimated the extent and power of the people involved in the fraudulent scheme. If they managed to suspend an internal audit and remove an auditor, it meant they had influence at very high levels of the company. That same afternoon, Richard approached James with an unexpected proposal. "James, I have an interesting opportunity for you," Richard began with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "What kind of opportunity, Mr. Richard?" "The company is expanding operations and needs a technical supervisor for a new branch opening in Philadelphia. It's a significant promotion, with a 40% salary increase," Richard explained. James immediately became suspicious. "And when would this transfer be?" "As soon as possible. In fact, if you accept, you could start next week," Richard replied. The offer of an immediate promotion after discovering the fraudulent scheme couldn't be a coincidence. It was clearly an attempt to remove James from the auto shop before he could cause more trouble. "May I think about the proposal?" James asked. "Of course, but I need an answer by tomorrow. It's an opportunity that won't come again soon," Richard pressured. That night, James talked with his wife, Sarah, about the situation. He had decided to tell her everything, as he needed someone trustworthy to discuss his options. "James, this is very dangerous," Sarah said after hearing the whole story. "If these people have enough power to suspend an internal audit, imagine what they can do to you if you don't accept the transfer." "But Sarah, if I accept the transfer, they'll keep stealing from the company and harming innocent employees. And besides, what guarantee do I have that they won't fire me as soon as I'm far from here?" James argued. Sarah fell silent for a few moments, clearly worried about her husband's safety. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet. But I have a feeling that if I accept this transfer, I'll just be postponing the problem. These people won't simply forget that I know the truth," James reflected. The next morning, James made a courageous decision. He wouldn't accept the transfer and would continue working normally, but he would be extremely alert to any retaliation attempts. When Richard asked about his decision, James replied, "Mr. Richard, I appreciate the offer, but I prefer to continue working here. I like the work I do and the team." Richard's expression changed instantly. The fake smile disappeared and was replaced by a cold, calculating look. "Are you sure about your decision, James? Opportunities like this are rare." "I'm sure, Mr. Richard." "Very well. But I hope you don't regret this choice," Richard said with a threatening tone before walking away. James immediately knew he had made a powerful enemy. From that moment on, his position at the auto shop would become increasingly difficult. During the following days, James noticed a clear change in how he was treated. Richard began constantly criticizing his work, finding faults in jobs that would previously have been considered exemplary. "James, this alignment is poorly done," Richard said about a perfectly executed job. "James, you took too long to replace this simple part," He complained about a service that had been completed in the normal time. "James, your workbench is messy." He criticized an organization that was within normal standards. It was obvious that Richard was trying to create a record of performance problems to justify firing him for cause. James realized he needed to be very careful not to give any real opening for criticism. At the same time, James noticed that new vehicles from the company fleet began arriving at the auto shop with suspicious electrical problems. The pattern was repeating, but now James wasn't assigned to work on these vehicles. Instead, Richard brought mechanics from other company auto shops to work on these specific cases. James realized that his discovery of the scheme had forced a reorganization of the fraudulent operations. 2 weeks after refusing the transfer, James experienced a day he would never forget. It was a Friday when 3 company employees arrived at the auto shop with instructions to conduct a complete inventory of all equipment and tools. "Why are you doing inventory here?" James asked one of the employees. "Orders from above. We have to verify that all registered equipment is actually here," the employee explained. During the inventory, James carefully observed the process. The employees were especially interested in electronic testing and measurement equipment, exactly the type of equipment that appeared in the documents he had found in David's truck. By the end of the day, the inventory employees had found several discrepancies. Expensive equipment that should have been in the auto shop simply wasn't found. "Where are the equipment items that weren't located?" one of the employees asked Richard. "They must be being used for external services. I'll check with administration on Monday," Richard replied, but James noticed his hands were trembling slightly. That night, James decided he needed to act before it was too late. He called the company's main number and asked to speak with the Human Resources Department. "I'd like to report irregularities related to the manager of the auto shop where I work," James told the operator. "What kind of irregularities?" "Misappropriation of company equipment and retaliation against employees who discover these irregularities," James explained. The operator forwarded him to the Human Resources Manager, Dr. Jennifer Thompson. James scheduled a meeting for the following Monday, 3 days before completing 15 years of work at the company. Over the weekend, James organized all the evidence he had collected: photos of the cut cable, documents found in the truck, records of suspicious patterns in David's vehicles, and a detailed account of all the intimidation attempts he had suffered. On Monday morning, James arrived early at the company for his meeting with Dr. Jennifer. She was a woman of about 50, known in the company for her integrity and firmness in enforcing corporate policies. "Mr. James, I understand you have some serious concerns to report," Dr. Jennifer began the meeting. "Yes, ma'am. I discovered a systematic scheme of misappropriation of company equipment that has been going on for at least 2 years, James replied, handing over a folder with all the evidence he had collected. Dr. Jennifer carefully examined each document and each photo. Her expression grew increasingly serious as she absorbed the implications of the evidence presented. "Mr. James, these are very serious allegations. Are you sure you're prepared for the consequences of making these accusations?" she asked. "I am prepared, Doctor. I cannot remain silent knowing the company is being harmed in this way," James replied with conviction. "Very well. I will initiate a complete and confidential investigation into these allegations. During the investigation, you will continue working normally, but any attempt at retaliation must be immediately reported to this department," Dr. Jennifer instructed. "Understood, Doctor. And Mr. James, I want you to know that the company values employees with the courage to defend corporate integrity. Regardless of the outcome of this investigation, your attitude will be recognized," she added. James left the meeting feeling more confident than he had in weeks. He had finally reported his findings to someone with real authority to act on them, but his confidence was shaken when he arrived at the auto shop and found Richard waiting for him with a furious expression. "James, where were you this morning? Your shift starts at 7 o'clock, Richard questioned aggressively. "I had to take care of an urgent personal matter, Mr. Richard. I'll make up for the lost time," James replied diplomatically. "Personal matters during work hours are not tolerated. This will go on your disciplinary record," Richard threatened. James realized that Richard had discovered his absence from the auto shop and suspected he was reporting the irregularities. The situation was becoming increasingly tense. During the following days, the pressure on James intensified dramatically. Richard began giving him tasks impossible to complete in the allotted time, hoping to create evidence of poor performance. "James, this engine needs to be ready in 2 hours," Richard said about a job that would normally take at least 4 hours. "James, why didn't you finish this job yesterday? The customer is complaining." Richard invented complaints from non-existent customers. "James, your attitude has been harming the work environment here." Richard made vague accusations without specifying problematic behaviors. Despite the constant pressure, James remained calm and carefully documented every attempt at intimidation. He knew that Dr. Jennifer had warned about reporting retaliation, and he was creating a detailed record of everything. 1 week after his meeting with Dr. Jennifer, something unexpected happened. James was working on a Chevrolet Spark when he heard raised voices coming from Richard's office. It was an intense argument, but he couldn't make out the words. A few minutes later, Richard came out of the room visibly shaken, followed by 2 men in suits, whom James didn't recognize. The men quickly left the auto shop without speaking to anyone. Jennifer discreetly approached James. "James, I think something big is going on. Richard seems to be in a panic." "Did you hear anything from the conversation?" James asked. "Not much, but I heard the words audit and evidence." "I think it has to do with the investigation," Jennifer whispered. For the rest of the day, Richard stayed in his office, making constant phone calls. James could see through the glass window that he was extremely agitated, gesturing a lot while talking. At 4 in the afternoon, Dr. Jennifer arrived at the auto shop, accompanied by 2 company security guards. She went straight to Richard's office and closed the door. All the employees in the shop stopped working and tried discreetly to find out what was happening. The tension in the air was palpable. 15 minutes later, Richard came out of his office accompanied by the security guards. He was carrying a box with his personal belongings and avoided looking at any of the employees. Dr. Jennifer addressed all the gathered employees. "Everyone, Mr. Richard Mitchell no longer works for this company. From now on, the auto shop will be temporarily supervised by Mr. Robert Anderson, who will arrive tomorrow morning." After Richard's departure, Dr. Jennifer approached James. "Mr. James, I'd like to speak with you privately." They went into the room that until a few minutes before had been occupied by Richard. Dr. Jennifer closed the door and turned to James with a grateful expression. "Mr. James, your courage in reporting the irregularities was crucial to our investigation. We uncovered a fraud scheme that caused hundreds of thousands of dollars in losses for the company," she began. "And what happens now?" James asked. "Richard Mitchell has been fired for cause and is under criminal investigation. His brother-in-law, David, is also being prosecuted. All the stolen equipment will be recovered," Dr. Jennifer explained. "And the other employees who were unfairly dismissed in recent years. We are reviewing all cases of dismissals authorized by Richard over the past 3 years. Employees who were unfairly dismissed will be invited to return, with appropriate compensation for the damages caused," she replied. James felt a wave of relief and satisfaction. His brave decision to expose the fraud had resulted in justice not only for the company, but also for colleagues who had been unfairly harmed. "Mr. James, the company would like to offer you a promotion to Quality and Integrity Supervisor. You would be responsible for implementing new procedures to prevent future fraud," Dr. Jennifer offered. "I gladly accept, Doctor, but can I continue working directly with vehicles too?" "I love the technical work," James replied. "Of course, the position would be a combination of supervision and technical work. I believe your hands-on experience will be valuable in identifying potential irregularities," she confirmed. 3 months later, the auto shop had completely transformed. Under the new supervision, an environment of transparency and technical quality was established. James, in his new position, implemented rigorous auditing and control procedures that made it impossible to repeat the type of fraud Richard had perpetrated. The mechanics who had been unfairly dismissed returned to work, and the auto shop became known in the area for its professional integrity. James established a mentorship program where he taught not only repair techniques, but also the importance of honesty and integrity in the workplace. One Saturday morning, 6 months after Richard's dismissal, James was at his workbench when Jennifer approached him with news that would make him even prouder of his choices. "James, have you seen today's paper?" she asked, showing him the business section of a local newspaper. The headline read, "Local company implements groundbreaking corporate integrity program." The article described how the exposure of the fraudulent scheme had led the company to develop new procedures that became a model for other businesses in the area. "Look here," Jennifer pointed to a section of the article. "They mentioned that it all started with the courage of an employee who decided to do the right thing, even knowing it could cost him his job." James read the article with growing emotion. His decision to expose the fraud had not only protected the company and his colleagues, but had also created a positive impact that extended beyond the auto shop. That afternoon, while James was teaching diagnostic techniques to a young apprentice, he reflected on the journey he had taken. From the day he discovered the cut cable to becoming an example of professional integrity, it had been a life-changing experience in ways he never imagined. "Mr. James," the apprentice interrupted his thoughts, "how do you always know the right thing to do?" James smiled, remembering himself 15 years earlier when he started working at the auto shop with the same thirst to learn and grow. "The right thing is usually not the easiest," he replied, "but it's always worth it in the end." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. In the months that followed, the auto shop not only regained its reputation, but became a benchmark for transparency and technical quality throughout the New York metropolitan area. James, now respected for both his technical competence and moral integrity, began receiving invitations to give lectures on professional ethics at other companies. One Monday morning, approximately a year after the whole episode with Richard, James arrived at the auto shop and found a surprise waiting for him. It was engineer Timothy Carter, the internal auditor who had initially investigated the case before being mysteriously removed. "Mr. James, I hope you remember me," Timothy said, extending his hand with a genuine smile. "Of course I remember, Mr. Timothy. How are you?" "I heard you had some health problems," James replied, shaking the auditor's hand. "Actually, they weren't health problems. I was temporarily removed because some influential people in the company didn't want my investigation to continue. But when Dr. Jennifer took over the case and exposed the whole truth, I was reinstated and promoted," Timothy explained. James was surprised to learn that Timothy had also been a victim of the same scheme that had tried to silence him. "I imagine how you must have felt, knowing you had uncovered irregularities and being prevented from continuing the investigation." "Exactly how you must have felt when you discovered the truth about the cut cable," Timothy replied. "That's why I came here today. I want to personally thank you for your courage in continuing to fight for the truth, even when I couldn't." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Robert Anderson, the new manager of the auto shop. Robert was a man of approximately 50 years, with decades of experience in the automotive industry and an impeccable reputation for honesty and competence. "James, may I speak with you for a moment?" Robert asked, with his calm and respectful manner of addressing employees. "Of course, Mr. Robert. I've received a proposal from headquarters that I'd like to discuss with you. The company is expanding operations and needs someone to oversee the implementation of new integrity procedures across all shops in the network. It would be a significant promotion but would require some travel," Robert explained. James was surprised by the proposal. During the previous year, he had focused completely on improving procedures at the shop where he worked, never imagining his efforts had drawn attention at such high levels of the company. "May I think about the proposal?" James asked. "Of course, but I'd like you to know this isn't a disguised transfer like the one Richard tried to force. It's genuine recognition of your work and an opportunity to multiply the positive impact you've created here," Robert assured him. That evening, James discussed the new opportunity with Sarah. The difference was striking compared to the conversation they'd had a year earlier, when he was being bullied by Richard. "James, this time it's different," Sarah said after hearing about the proposal. "This time you're being recognized for doing the right thing, not being punished for it." "That's true, But it also means I'll be taking on much greater responsibility. It won't just be about our shop, but about ensuring the same type of fraud doesn't happen anywhere in the company, James reflected. And you don't think you're prepared for that? Sarah asked with a smile that showed her confidence in her husband. Actually, I think it's exactly the kind of work I've always wanted to do, helping create an environment where honest employees can work without fear of retaliation, James replied. The next morning, James sought out Robert to accept the promotion, but before giving his final answer, he made one important condition. Mr. Robert, I accept the position, but I'd like to continue coming back here regularly to work directly with the cars. I don't want to lose touch with the technical work that taught me everything about professional integrity, James said. Perfect. Actually, that will make you more effective in the new position. You'll be the only supervisor who understands the actual technical challenges mechanics face, Robert replied, approving the condition. 2 months later, James was on his first official trip to implement the new procedures at a shop in Detroit. Upon arrival, he encountered a strangely familiar situation: nervous employees, a defensive manager, and several irregularities in equipment records. During his inspection, James applied the same careful observation techniques he had developed while investigating Richard's scheme. In no time, he identified clear signs that similar problems were occurring at the branch. Everyone, James addressed the shop mechanics, I want you to know I'm here to help, not to create problems for honest employees. If anyone has information about irregularities, you can speak with me confidentially. James's direct and honest approach quickly gained the employees' trust. Within 2 hours, 3 mechanics approached him with information about vehicles being sabotaged to create excuses for unnecessary and expensive repairs. The pattern was almost identical to what Richard had implemented: company fleet vehicles, developing suspicious problems, lengthy and expensive repairs, and equipment disappearing during the process. James carefully documented all evidence and reported his findings to headquarters. Within days, the branch manager was fired and a new audit system was implemented. During the following 6 months, James visited 12 auto shops in different cities across New York State. In 8 of them, he found similar irregularities. The scheme Richard had developed had apparently been replicated across multiple company branches. It's astonishing how corruption can spread when there aren't proper controls, James commented to Dr. Jennifer during a follow-up meeting. That's why your work is so important, she replied. You're not just identifying existing problems, but creating systems that prevent new ones from developing. On his 10th visit, James faced his biggest challenge yet. The Philadelphia auto shop was managed by a man named Frank Wilson, who had been promoted internally and had many allies within the company. When James arrived for the routine inspection, Frank greeted him with open hostility. I don't know why you're wasting time with these inspections. My shop has been running perfectly for 5 years. I'm sure it runs well, James replied diplomatically. I'm just here to implement the new documentation procedures the company has adopted. Unnecessary procedures created by people who don't understand how an auto shop really works, Frank retorted scornfully. Frank's defensive attitude immediately caught James's attention. During previous inspections, honest managers had been receptive or, at most, slightly inconvenienced by the changes. Open hostility usually indicated there was something to hide. James spent 2 days at the Philadelphia auto shop, carefully observing processes and talking with employees. On the 2nd day, he made an alarming discovery. The shop was processing 3 times more company fleet vehicles than would be normal for a unit of its size. Why do you receive so many fleet vehicles? James asked Frank. We're efficient. Headquarters prefers sending vehicles here because we solve problems quickly, Frank answered. But his explanation didn't match the records James had examined. In fact, the records showed vehicles stayed weeks in the shop, much longer than necessary for the types of repairs being performed. During a private conversation with one of the senior mechanics, James discovered the truth. Mr. James, Frank has an arrangement with some fleet managers. They send vehicles here that don't need repairs. Frank creates inflated estimates and then splits the extra money with the managers. Are you sure about this? James asked. Yes. I've worked on vehicles that arrived here in perfect condition, and left with the same problems that were allegedly fixed, always with very high invoices, the mechanic confirmed. James was facing the most sophisticated scheme he had encountered yet. It wasn't just about equipment being stolen, but about the company being systematically defrauded through fake repairs and inflated estimates. That night in his hotel, James called Dr. Jennifer to report his preliminary findings. "Doctor, the situation in Philadelphia is more serious than we imagined. There's evidence of fraud involving multiple people, including fleet managers." "What evidence do you have?" she asked. "Vehicle records showing weeks in the shop for simple repairs, systematically inflated estimates, and a pattern of cooperation between the local manager and fleet managers to process vehicles unnecessarily," James listed. "James, this is very serious. I want you to document everything carefully, but don't confront anyone yet. We'll need irrefutable evidence before acting," Dr. Jennifer instructed. The next day, James continued his investigation discreetly. He discovered that Frank had created a network of complicity that extended far beyond his auto shop. Managers from different departments were involved, creating a scheme that diverted hundreds of thousands of reais annually. The investigation in Philadelphia took 3 weeks to complete. When James finally presented his report to senior management, the evidence was so extensive that it resulted in the largest internal investigation in the company's history. 7 people were fired for just cause, including Frank and 4 fleet managers. The scheme had operated for over 3 years, causing losses of more than 1 million reais for the company. "James, once again your dedication saved the company from enormous losses," the company president, Mr. Anthony Roberts, said during a meeting where James was publicly recognized for his work. "Thank you, Mr. Anthony. But I want to make it clear that this was only possible because the company created an environment where employees can report irregularities without fear of retaliation," James replied. After the scheme in Philadelphia was exposed, James became a well-known figure throughout the company. Employees from different units began approaching him to report suspicions of irregularities, knowing he would take their concerns seriously. Over the next 2 years, James oversaw the implementation of new integrity procedures in more than 50 company units. In 23 of them, he found evidence of irregularities ranging from minor material diversions to complex fraud schemes. Each resolved case further strengthened his conviction that he had chosen the right path when he decided to expose the first scheme he discovered. His courageous decision had triggered a complete transformation in the company's corporate culture. On a Tuesday morning, 2.5 years after his first discovery, James received a call that moved him deeply. It was Daniel, one of the mechanics who had been unfairly fired by Richard years before. "James, I want to thank you personally for what you did. Not only did I get my job back, but the company compensated me for all the years I was unemployed because of Richard's lies," Daniel said, his voice choked with emotion. "Daniel, you don't need to thank me. Anyone in my position would have done the same thing," James replied, though he knew that wasn't true. Many people would have chosen the safety of silence. "No, James. It's not true that anyone would have done the same. You risked your career to do the right thing, and because of that, not only me but dozens of other families have benefited," Daniel insisted. The conversation with Daniel made James reflect on the real impact of his actions. It wasn't just about money saved for the company or improved procedures. It was about families who had been unfairly harmed and now had their lives restored. That afternoon, James was in his original auto shop, working on a Ford Fiesta, when Sarah arrived with a surprise. She rarely visited the auto shop, preferring to let James focus on his work. "James, I have some news for you," she said with a radiant smile. "What news?" "The City Council is going to award you a Civic Merit Medal at next month's ceremony. For your work in promoting integrity and honesty in the business environment," Sarah announced. James was surprised and moved. When he had discovered the cut wire 2.5 years earlier, he never imagined that his decision to do the right thing would have such far-reaching repercussions. "A Civic Merit Medal," he repeated, still processing the news. "Yes. Apparently, the changes you helped implement have become a model for other companies in the region. The mayor's office wants to recognize the positive impact this has had on the local business community," Sarah explained. The medal presentation ceremony was held a month later in the mayor's office. Besides Sarah, Dr. Jennifer Robert Anderson, and many of the employees whose lives had been positively impacted by James's work were present. Mr. James Michael Carter, the mayor began his speech, "Your courage in defending professional integrity not only protected your company, but created an example that inspired positive changes throughout our business community." While receiving the medal, James thought about all the moments of doubt he had faced. The moments when he questioned whether he was doing the right thing, whether it was worth risking his financial security for moral principles. "Ladies and gentlemen," James addressed the audience after receiving the medal, "when I discovered irregularities in my workplace, my first reaction was fear. Fear of losing my job, fear of retaliation, fear that no one would believe me." The audience was in absolute silence, hanging on every word. "But I learned that courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is doing the right thing even when you are afraid. And the right thing is always worth it, even when the path is difficult," James continued. After the ceremony, James returned to work with a renewed sense of purpose. His story had become bigger than him, inspiring other people to defend integrity in their own workplaces. 3 months after the ceremony, James received an invitation to participate in a national television program about business ethics. The program wanted to highlight real stories of employees who had made significant differences in their organizations. "Mr. James, for our viewers who may be facing similar situations, what advice would you give?" the host asked during the interview. "First, document everything carefully. Emotions and suspicions are not enough. Concrete evidence is necessary. Second, seek the appropriate channels within the company before taking external measures. And third, remember that you are not alone. There will always be honest people willing to support those who do the right thing," James replied. The interview was seen by millions of people and resulted in hundreds of letters and emails from viewers sharing their own experiences with ethical dilemmas at work. James personally responded to each message, offering advice and encouragement. During the months following the television interview, James began receiving invitations to give lectures at universities, companies, and conferences about business ethics. He accepted these invitations whenever possible, seeing them as opportunities to multiply the positive impact of his experience. At one of these lectures, at a university in New York, an engineering student asked a question that made him reflect deeply on his journey. "Professor James," the student said. James had insisted he was not a professor, but the students insisted on calling him that. "Have you ever regretted exposing the irregularities? I mean, your life could have been simpler if you had remained silent." James smiled, remembering a time when that question tormented him. "No, I have never regretted it. My life may not have become simpler, but it certainly became more meaningful. When you do the right thing, even at a high cost, you can sleep peacefully knowing you've maintained your integrity." After the lecture, James was approached by a young business administration student. "Mr. James, thank you for sharing your story. My father works at a company where he suspects misconduct, but he's afraid to report it because of our financial situation." "Tell your father I understand his fear," James replied, "but also tell him there are ways to report irregularities that minimize personal risks, and that serious organizations protect employees who act with integrity." The conversation with the student led him to develop an idea that would become one of the most important projects of his career. James proposed to the company the creation of a support program for employees who wanted to report misconduct, but were worried about the consequences. "Dr. Jennifer," James explained during a meeting, "many employees know about irregularities, but don't report them out of fear. If we create a program that offers legal protection and temporary financial support for these employees, we can identify problems much earlier before they cause significant damage." The proposal was approved by senior management and implemented 6 months later. The Integrity Protection Program became a model for other companies and resulted in the identification of dozens of irregularities that otherwise might have gone unnoticed for years. 5 years after discovering the cut cable, James was in his office. He now had his own office as Director of Corporate Integrity when he received a visit that deeply surprised him. It was Richard Mitchell, his former manager. 5 years older, with greying hair and an expression of genuine regret, Richard asked for a few minutes to talk. "James, I know I have no right to ask for anything after what I did, but I'd like to speak with you," Richard said hesitantly. James was surprised but curious. "Of course, Richard, come in. First, I want to apologize for what I did to you and other employees. There's no justification for my actions," Richard began. "I accept your apology," James replied simply. "Second, I want you to know that your attitude changed my life in ways you can't imagine," Richard continued. "How so?" "After I was fired, I went through a very difficult period. I lost my house, my wife almost left me, my children were ashamed of me. But that period forced me to reflect on who I had become," Richard explained. James listened in silence, allowing Richard to continue. "During these 5 years, I worked in smaller jobs, rethought my values, and slowly rebuilt my life based on honesty. Today I work in a small auto shop, where I'm just a mechanic, but I sleep peacefully every night," Richard said. "I'm glad to hear you found your way back," James replied sincerely. "James, I want you to know that although I hated you at the time for exposing my corruption, today I'm grateful. You saved me from continuing down a path that only led to destruction," Richard concluded. The conversation with Richard was deeply impactful for James. It showed him that even people who were initially harmed by his decision to expose misconduct could eventually benefit from the consequences. 2 years after this conversation, James received an invitation to write a book about his experience. The publisher wanted a work that could serve as a practical guide for professionals facing similar ethical dilemmas. "Mr. James, we believe your story can inspire and guide many people who are facing difficult situations in their work environments," the editor explained. James accepted the project, seeing it as an opportunity to reach people who might never attend one of his lectures or participate in a television program. The book, The Courage of Integrity: How a Cut Cable Changed My Life, was published 2 years later and became a bestseller in the professional development category. The sales generated resources that James used to create a foundation dedicated to supporting employees facing ethical dilemmas at work. During the book launch ceremony, James gave a speech summarizing the philosophy he had developed throughout his journey. "When I discovered that cut cable almost 10 years ago, I was just a mechanic trying to do my job as best as I could. I never imagined that this discovery would change not only my life, but also the lives of hundreds of others," James began. "I learned that integrity isn't a luxury we can afford only when it's convenient. Integrity is a fundamental necessity that defines who we are as people and as professionals," he continued. "Each of you, at some point in your careers, will face a situation where you'll have to choose between doing the easy thing and doing the right thing. I hope my story encourages you to always choose to do the right thing," James concluded. The audience rose in a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. Among those present were many of the employees who had benefited from James's work over the years, creating a moment of intense emotion. The night after the launch, James was at home with Sarah, reflecting on the extraordinary journey they had shared since that tense afternoon when he discovered the cut cable. "James, do you have any regrets about the choices you made?" Sarah asked. "None," James replied without hesitation. "Every difficulty we faced, every moment of uncertainty, every sacrifice we made was worth it, not just for the professional outcomes, but for who I've become as a person." "And what do you think would have happened if you hadn't discovered the cut cable that day?" Sarah asked. James thought for a moment before answering. "I think I would have discovered other irregularities eventually. The kind of person who cuts a cable to sabotage a vehicle doesn't stop there. Sooner or later, Richard would have done something I couldn't ignore." "So you think you were destined to face this situation?" "I don't know if I was destined, but I know I was prepared. 15 years of honest work gave me the confidence and competence needed to recognize that something was wrong and do something about it," James reflected. 10 years after discovering the cut cable, James was driving through the city when he passed by the auto shop where it had all begun. The sign now read, "Mitchell & Sons Auto Shop, certified in corporate integrity," indicating that the unit had become one of the first to receive certification from the program James had developed. He stopped the car and entered the shop, immediately being recognized by the employees. Jennifer, now the administrative supervisor, approached with a warm smile. "James, what a wonderful surprise to see you here," she said, hugging the man who had become a legend in the company. "Jennifer, how are things around here?" "Fantastic. The shop has never run better. The employees are happy, customers trust our work, and everyone knows they can speak up about any concerns without fear of retaliation," Jennifer replied. James walked through the shop observing the positive and productive atmosphere. It was exactly the kind of work environment he had dreamed of creating when he began implementing the new integrity procedures. In the bay where he had discovered the cut cable, a young mechanic of about 25 years now worked. James approached and introduced himself. "Mr. James, it's an honor to meet you in person. I read your book during my technical training," the young mechanic said enthusiastically. "What's your name?" "Christopher Carter, and I want you to know that your story inspired me to choose this profession. I want to be the kind of professional who makes a difference," Christopher replied. The conversation with Christopher made James realize that his influence had extended even to the next generation of professionals. Young mechanics were entering the profession inspired not only by the technical aspect of the work, but also by the ethical values he had helped promote. During the following years, James continued expanding his work promoting corporate integrity. He established partnerships with universities to develop professional ethics curricula, worked with government organizations to create whistleblower protection policies, and collaborated with companies of all sizes to implement integrity programs. On his 50th birthday, 3 years later, James received a tribute he considered the highlight of his career. The National Association of Manufacturers chose him as Professional of the Year in recognition of his impact on promoting business ethics. During the award ceremony, held in Washington, D.C., James was introduced by none other than the association's president as the mechanic who changed the face of corporate integrity in the United States. "Ladies and gentlemen," James said in his acceptance speech, "when I began my career as a mechanic over 20 years ago, my goal was simple: to do good work and support my family. I never imagined that one day I would be here, speaking about integrity to leaders from across the nation." The audience laughed and applauded, clearly captivated by James's humility and authenticity. "But I learned that no matter our position or profession, we all have the power and responsibility to promote integrity in our workplaces. Integrity isn't a privilege for executives or managers, it's every worker's responsibility," James continued. "Today, when I return to that auto shop where I discovered the cut cable, I see young mechanics working with pride and dignity, knowing their voices will be heard if they identify problems. That's what truly matters, creating environments where honesty is valued and protected," James concluded. The ovation was so intense and prolonged that James had to make several gestures asking the audience to sit before he could leave the stage. After the ceremony, during the official dinner, James was approached by dozens of business owners and executives who wanted to learn more about the integrity programs he had developed. Many wanted to implement similar systems in their own companies. "Mr. James," said an executive from a large multinational corporation, "our company has operations in 12 countries. Would it be possible to adapt your methods for such diverse cultural contexts?" "The details may vary between cultures," James replied, "but the fundamental principles are universal. Honesty, transparency, and protection for those who do the right thing are values that resonate anywhere in the world." The conversation resulted in an invitation for James to develop an international consulting program, expanding his work beyond US borders. It was an opportunity he had never imagined, but that aligned perfectly with his mission to promote integrity in the corporate environment. During the next 5 years, James traveled to more than 30 countries, helping companies of all sizes implement integrity programs. Each country presented unique challenges, but also confirmed his conviction that ethical principles are truly universal. At a conference in London, James met Sarah Mitchell, a British engineer who had gone through a similar experience to his, exposing fraud at a construction company. They became frequent collaborators, developing methodologies that combined their experiences in different sectors. "James," Sarah said during one of their collaborations. "Your story proves that heroism doesn't require grand dramatic gestures. Sometimes heroism is simply doing what we know is right, even when it's hard." The partnership with Sarah resulted in the development of a training program that was adopted by companies in over 15 countries. The program became a global benchmark in fraud prevention and corporate integrity promotion. On his 55th birthday, James decided to cut back on his international travels to focus on work in the United States and spend more time with Sarah, who had been his constant companion throughout the journey. "Sarah," he said during the birthday dinner, "I want you to know that nothing we achieved would have been possible without your support. You were my anchor during the toughest times." "James, it was an honor to share this journey with you. Seeing the difference you made in so many people's lives was the most precious gift I could ever receive," Sarah replied, with tears of pride in her eyes. That same year, James received an invitation that moved him deeply. The Federal University in his hometown wanted to award him an honorary doctorate in recognition of his contributions to business ethics. "Professor James," the dean said during the ceremony. James had finally accepted the title of professor, though he continued to insist he was just a mechanic. "Your story demonstrates that true education doesn't only happen in classrooms, but in every workplace where ethical professionals choose to do the right thing." During his acceptance speech, James reflected on the extraordinary journey that had taken him from a simple technical discovery to international academic recognition. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "when I discovered that cut wire 15 years ago, I was motivated by a simple concern: to ensure that a vehicle functioned properly. I never imagined that discovery would lead me to understand that integrity is like a wire in an electrical system. When it's cut, the whole system stops working properly." The audience fell silent, captivated by the metaphor. Our society is a complex system, and integrity is the wire that connects all components. When we allow corruption to cut these wires, the entire system suffers. But when we have the courage to identify and repair these broken connections, the whole system starts functioning as it should, James continued. "Each one of you, regardless of your profession or position, has the ability to be an integrity technician. You can identify where ethical connections are broken and work to repair them. That is the responsibility and privilege of living in a free society," James concluded. The applause was so intense it lasted nearly 10 minutes, with the entire audience standing in recognition not just of his words, but of the extraordinary journey he had shared with them. After the ceremony, James was approached by a young engineering student who asked him a question that made him reflect on the legacy he was creating. "Professor James, how can we ensure that future generations of professionals maintain the same ethical standards you helped establish?" James thought carefully before answering. "Ethics isn't something that can be imposed from the outside. It must be cultivated through example and continuous education. Every ethical professional who acts with courage inspires others to do the same. That's how lasting changes happen." "But what if economic pressures make people choose dishonest shortcuts?" "It's exactly when pressures are greatest that our integrity is most important," James replied. "Anyone can be honest when it's easy. The true test of character comes when honesty has a cost, and I can assure you, based on my experience, that initial cost is always much smaller than the price of living with ethical compromises." 16 years after discovering the cut cable, James was working in his office when he received a call that filled him with pride and emotion. It was Christopher Carter, the young mechanic he had met years before at the auto shop. "Professor James, I have news to share with you," Christopher said with excitement in his voice. "What news, Christopher?" "I've just been promoted to shop manager, and I want you to know that my first action will be implementing a mentorship program based on the principles you taught. I want to ensure every young mechanic working here learns not just repair techniques, but ethical values too," Christopher explained. The news moved James deeply. Seeing the next generation taking responsibility for perpetuating the ethical values he had helped establish was confirmation that his work had created a lasting impact. "Christopher, that's fantastic. You have my full support, and if you need any help developing the mentorship program, I'll be available," James offered. Actually, Professor, I'd like to invite you to be the keynote speaker at the program's launch ceremony. It would be an honor to have the creator of the integrity principles we follow presiding over the beginning of this new phase, Christopher requested. James immediately accepted the invitation. The opportunity to participate in implementing a professional ethics mentorship program was exactly the kind of project that motivated him most. The ceremony was held 3 months later at the very auto shop where everything had begun. Employees of all ages were present, from veteran mechanics to young apprentices, along with company executives and representatives from the local community. Ladies and gentlemen, James began his speech, 16 years ago in this very auto shop, I discovered something that changed my life forever. It wasn't a revolutionary technological discovery. It was the simple realization that someone had deliberately cut a cable to sabotage a vehicle. He gestured toward the bay where he had made the original discovery. That discovery taught me that integrity, like an electrical cable, is fundamental to the functioning of any system. And today, I see a new generation of professionals committing to keep those cables always connected, ensuring our work community continues operating based on honesty and trust, James continued. During his speech, James noticed tears in the eyes of several employees present. These were people whose lives had been positively impacted by the programs he had developed over the years. The mentorship program Christopher is launching today ensures ethical values aren't just pretty words in corporate manuals, but living principles that guide every action, every decision, every interaction in this work environment, James said. After the speech, James was approached by a young female mechanic of about 22. She was one of the first women to work at the auto shop, representing a significant cultural change that had accompanied the ethical transformations. Professor James, I want to thank you for everything you've done to create an environment where people like me can work with dignity and respect, she said sincerely. What's your name? James asked. Jessica Ann. And I want you to know that I chose this profession because I knew that thanks to your work, I would be treated fairly and have opportunities based on my competence, not on prejudices, Jessica Ann explained. The conversation with Jessica Ann showed James that the impact of his work had extended far beyond fraud prevention. It had helped create more inclusive and respectful work environments for all employees. At the end of the ceremony, James walked alone through the auto shop, revisiting the places where his journey had begun. In the bay where he discovered the cut cable, there was now a small, discreet plaque, location where modern corporate integrity began in our company, March 16, 2008. The plaque had been the idea of the employees themselves, who wanted to create a permanent reminder of the importance of doing the right thing, even when it's difficult. During the trip back home, James reflected on the extraordinary journey his life had taken. From a mechanic worried about a simple technical problem, he had become an international symbol of professional integrity. But what made him most proud wasn't the recognition or awards he had received. It was knowing that in auto shops, offices, factories, and companies around the world, there were professionals who chose to do the right thing because they had been inspired by his story. 18 years after discovering the cut cable, James was at home preparing for retirement. At 61 years old, he felt he had fulfilled his life's mission and was ready for a new phase of less intense activities. Sarah, now with graying hair but the same radiant smile that had captivated James decades before, was helping him organize his files and documents. "James, look what I found," she said, showing an old photo from the first time he had been interviewed on television. "It seems like a lifetime ago," James commented, observing his younger self in the picture. "In a sense it was," Sarah replied. "The man who was interviewed that day was different from the man you became. The journey changed you." "Changed for the better?" James asked playfully. "Definitely for the better. You became not only a better professional, but a better person. And more importantly, you helped many other people become better too," Sarah answered sincerely. That evening, James was reading in his favorite armchair when the phone rang. It was an international number he didn't recognize. "Professor James Carter," a voice with an American accent asked. "Yes, speaking." "My name is Michael Johnson. I'm a journalist with the Washington Post, and I'm writing a series about everyday heroes around the world. I'd like to include your story in the series. May I interview you?" James was surprised. Even retired, his story continued to inspire people in places he had never visited. "Of course, it would be an honor," James replied. The interview resulted in a full-page article in the American newspaper with the title, "The Mechanic Who Changed Corporate America." The article was republished in dozens of international newspapers and resulted in invitations to lecture at American and European universities. At 63 years old, James agreed to do one final lecture tour, this time focused on sharing the lessons learned over 2 decades of work in corporate integrity. During a lecture at Harvard University, James was introduced as one of the modern pioneers in applied business ethics. The auditorium was packed with MBA students, professors, and executives interested in his perspectives. "Ladies and gentlemen," James began, "I came here not as an academic or theorist, but as someone who has personally experienced the challenges of maintaining integrity in complex corporate environments." The American audience was clearly fascinated by his practical approach and concrete examples. "Throughout my career, I've learned that integrity isn't an abstract concept. It's a practical skill that must be developed and exercised constantly. Like any skill, it grows stronger with use and weaker with neglect," James explained. A student raised their hand. "Professor Carter, how can we prepare organizations to deal with employees who are afraid to report misconduct?" Excellent question. Fear of retaliation is the biggest obstacle to organizational integrity. Companies must not only create protection policies, but also demonstrate through concrete actions that they value employees who stand up for ethics, James replied. "Can you give a concrete example?" "Certainly. At my company, we created an emergency fund for employees who might face retaliation for reporting misconduct. We also established a system where these people receive mentorship and career support. The result is that people feel protected to speak up when they see problems," James explained. During the following 2 weeks, James gave lectures at 6 different American universities. Each lecture was followed by intense Q&A sessions where students and faculty explored the practical applications of his methods. In his final lecture at MIT, James reflected on the global impact that his simple discovery of a cut cable had generated. "When I return to the United States tomorrow," he said, "I'll carry with me the certainty that ethical principles are truly universal. The questions you've asked, the challenges you've identified, the solutions you've proposed, all this confirms that people of goodwill anywhere in the world want to work in honest and transparent environments." Back in the United States, James decided to write a second book, this time focusing on the international lessons he had learned during his American tour. The book, Integrity Without Borders, Global Lessons from an American Mechanic, was published 2 years later and became a reference in MBA programs around the world. At 65, James was finally enjoying a peaceful retirement when he received a call that filled him with emotion and pride. "Grandpa James," a young, excited voice said on the other end of the line. It was his granddaughter, Emily, 15 years old, daughter of his only son, Robert, who had become an engineer and followed the ethical values his father had always demonstrated. "Emily, how are you, my dear?" "Grandpa, I have amazing news. I won first place at the school science fair with a project about business ethics. I used your story as my main example," Emily announced enthusiastically. "That's wonderful. Tell me about your project." "I researched how a single individual can create positive change in large organizations. Your discovery of the cut cable was my main case study. I showed how one small but courageous action can have huge impacts," Emily explained. The conversation with Emily made James realize that his story had become part of the next generation's education. His granddaughter had learned about integrity not only through his direct teachings, but by academically studying the impact of his actions. 2 months later, Emily asked James to come to her school to give a talk to her class about ethics and integrity. It was the first time he would speak to such a young audience, and he was curious about how his concepts would be received by teenagers. "Everyone," Emily introduced her grandfather to the class, "this is my grandpa James. He is the mechanic who changed how American companies think about honesty." The group of 30 teenagers looked at James with curiosity mixed with the typical skepticism of their age. James decided to adapt his approach to be more relevant to them. "Folks, how many of you have ever worked somewhere, even if it's an internship or part-time job?" James began. About half the group raised their hands. "And how many of you have seen something happen at work or school that you knew was wrong but didn't do anything about?" This time, nearly the entire group raised their hands, some hesitantly. "Perfect. You're honest," James said with a smile. "We all face those moments. The difference between people with integrity and those without isn't never facing these situations. The difference is what we do when we encounter them." For the next 40 minutes, James told his story in a way the teenagers could relate to their own experiences. He drew parallels between uncovering corporate fraud and witnessing bullying at school, between reporting irregularities and reporting cheating on tests. "The question you should ask yourselves isn't, 'What will happen to me if I do the right thing?'" James concluded. "The right question is, 'What kind of person do I want to be?' Because in the end, our integrity is the only thing that truly belongs to us." At the end of the talk, a student raised her hand. "Mr. James, what should we do if our parents or teachers tell us not to get involved when we see something wrong?" The question touched James's heart. "That's a very important question," he replied. "Sometimes adults say that because they want to protect us. But you can explain to them that staying silent in the face of injustice doesn't protect us. It makes us accomplices. Start with small situations, demonstrate maturity and responsibility, and gradually, adults will learn to trust your judgment." After the talk, several students approached to ask more specific questions. James was impressed by the maturity and sincerity of their concerns. Driving home after the talk, James reflected on how rewarding it was to see that his story remained relevant to new generations. The ethical principles he had championed throughout his career weren't outdated concepts, but timeless values that each generation needed to rediscover and apply in their own contexts. At 66, James received an invitation he considered a special honor. The U.S. government wanted to award him the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian decoration related to the nation's business development. The ceremony was held in Washington, D.C., attended by the President, cabinet members, business leaders from across the country, and representatives of international organizations. "Mr. James Michael Carter," the President said during the ceremony, "your contribution to American business ethics development transcends any quantitative measure. You've proven that integrity isn't just compatible with business success, but fundamental to it." During his acceptance speech, James shared a reflection that summarized his life philosophy. "Your Excellencies," he began, "I accept this honor not in my own name, but in the name of all American workers who choose to do the right thing every day, even when nobody is watching." The audience applauded, but James continued humbly. "My story began with a cut wire, but the real story is the thousands of professionals across America who choose to keep the wires of integrity always connected. They are the true heroes of this transformation," James concluded. After the ceremony, James was approached by journalists from various countries interested in understanding how a mechanic had become a symbol of corporate integrity. "Mr. Carter," asked a CNN journalist, "what advice would you give to young professionals starting their careers today?" "3 pieces of advice," James replied. "First, never compromise your integrity for short-term gains. Second, always document suspicious situations before taking action. Third, remember that you're never alone. There are always honest people willing to support those who do the right thing." And for executives and business owners, create environments where integrity is not just protected, but celebrated. "Honest employees are the greatest asset any company can have," James answered. During the years following the National Award, James continued to be sought by organizations worldwide, interested in his methods for promoting corporate integrity. He accepted consulting work selectively, prioritizing projects that could create lasting impact. One such project was particularly special, creating an ethics code for small American businesses. Unlike large corporations with resources for specialized departments, small businesses often don't know how to implement integrity practices. James developed a simplified manual that could be implemented by any company, regardless of size. The manual included practical procedures, real examples, and low-cost tools to monitor and maintain ethical standards. Integrity can't be a privilege only for large companies, James explained during the manual's launch. Every business, no matter how small, can and should operate with transparency and honesty. The manual was distributed free to over 100,000 small American businesses and became a model for similar initiatives in other countries across the Americas. At 70 years old, James decided to focus his energies on one last major project, a complete autobiography that would serve as a practical manual for anyone facing ethical dilemmas at work. The Journey of a Cut Cable, Memoirs of a Life Dedicated to Integrity, took 3 years to write and included not only his personal story, but also detailed analyses of cases he had faced over decades. The book became a publishing phenomenon, selling over 500,000 copies in its first year. More important than sales numbers was the impact it had on readers around the world. James received hundreds of letters and emails from people sharing how the book had helped them confront difficult situations in their own work environments. Doctors reported having questioned questionable practices in hospitals. Teachers described how they had fought corruption in universities. Business owners told how they had reformed their practices to prioritize integrity. "Sarah," James said one evening, showing a folder full of letters, "I think I finally understand the true meaning of everything we lived through." "What is it?" "It wasn't about me discovering a cut cable. It was about how an ordinary person, doing the right thing at the right time, can create waves of positive change that spread far beyond what they could ever imagine," James reflected. Sarah smiled, remembering when James was just a mechanic concerned with technical problems. "You always underestimate what you did, James. It wasn't just about doing the right thing. It was having the courage to keep doing the right thing even when it got difficult." On his 75th birthday, James was surrounded by family, friends, colleagues, and people whose lives had been impacted by his work. Emily, now 25 and working as a business auditor, made a toast that deeply moved her grandfather. "Grandpa James," she said, raising her glass, "your story taught me that heroism isn't in grand gestures, but in everyday choices to do the right thing. Thank you for showing us that an ordinary person can make extraordinary differences." During the party, James spoke with dozens of people who had been inspired by his story. There were executives who had reshaped their companies, employees who had found the courage to report wrongdoing, and young people who had chosen careers based on ethical values. "Professor James," said a young engineer, "I want you to know that I chose my profession after reading about your story in school. Your example showed me that engineering isn't just about technique, but about social responsibility." Conversations like this repeated throughout the party, confirming for James that his decision to expose that first fraudulent scheme had created a legacy that would extend far beyond his own life. That night, after all the guests had left, James and Sarah sat in their garden, gazing at the stars and reflecting on the extraordinary journey they had shared. "James," Sarah said softly, "do you have any regrets about the path our life took?" James thought for a long moment before answering. "No regrets, Sarah. Maybe our life would have been simpler if I had stayed silent that first time, but it wouldn't have been a life worth living." "Why?" "Because I discovered that life's greatest satisfaction comes not from what we achieve for ourselves, but from the good we can do for others." Every person who found the courage to do the right thing after hearing our story made all the difficulties we faced worthwhile, James replied. At 78 years old, James began facing the natural challenges of age. His mobility was reduced, but his mind remained sharp, and his commitment to integrity unshakable. He spent his final active years creating a foundation dedicated to supporting employees facing ethical dilemmas at work. The James Carter Foundation for Corporate Integrity offered legal advice, temporary financial support, and mentorship for people who needed courage to do the right thing. Emily took over the executive leadership of the foundation, continuing her grandfather's legacy with the same passion and dedication he had demonstrated throughout his career. "Grandpa," Emily said during one of their last deep conversations, How can I ensure the foundation maintains the same values you established? Emily, James replied with the wisdom of decades of experience, values aren't maintained through rules or policies. Values are maintained through people who live them authentically every day. Hire people with integrity, treat them well, and they will naturally make the right choices. During his final years, James frequently received visitors from around the world interested in learning from his experience. Even with limited mobility, he continued sharing his lessons with anyone genuinely interested in promoting integrity. In one of his last interviews, given to a documentary filmmaker creating a film about his life, James was asked what he considered his greatest achievement. "My greatest achievement," James answered after a thoughtful pause, "wasn't any award or recognition I received. My greatest achievement was proving that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they have the courage to live according to their values." And what advice would you leave for future generations? That they always remember, integrity isn't something you either have or don't have. Integrity is something you choose, every day, in every decision, in every interaction. And that even when it seems like doing the right thing makes no difference, it always does. Maybe not immediately, maybe not in ways you can see, but it always makes a difference, James concluded. End of the story. Now tell us what you thought of the story and where you're watching from. If you have something to share with us, leave your sincere words in the comments. Do you believe James made the right decisions? We'd love to read your opinion. Thank you so much for joining us. Don't forget to leave your like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other exciting stories.